Good morning, everybody. Welcome to episode 116 of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Hawk Blogger. And I'm here a little early this morning. Usually we get going at 8 a.m., but I am trying to hit the trails a bit early. I got a long 2-hour drive to get where I'm going. And, I want to get on the road. I want to get there early. It's supposed to be a good enough hike that it's worth lugging up my camera, my heavier camera, and maybe my tripod. We'll see. If I get any good pictures, I'll bring them in to show tomorrow. Um, Yesterday, I did the Bridal Veil hike over near Gold Bar. Nice hike, not like the best hike ever, but pretty good. And as I'm finishing, I'm a sweater. I probably more information than you needed, but I've always been, and I'm like sweating my tail off, get in the car, enjoying the nice air conditioning, my pup and I, and drive down to Highway 2 to start heading back home and see this woman on the side of the road with 4 kids in a minivan and a flat tire, and she is struggling to get the jack to work. So I pull over, I help her change the tire again. Now I'm flop sweating again, just like absolutely crazy sweating. And I start going home and go to stick in the GPS stuff. I pretty much know the way, but I notice my phone's not working right. And turns out, I will save you the longer story, but some mistake at Verizon with something going on with their phones disabled my phone. So I couldn't get any reception. So I'm driving an hour and a half home, whatever it was. And sure enough, as I am getting almost home near Woodinville, I get pulled over. And I'll admit, I had not updated my tabs, so I got pulled over for that, and I'm sitting there thinking I can't even get my insurance card because my insurance card's on an app and it doesn't have reception right now. Thankfully, it was offline available and I was able to get through it. And I think I'm gonna give credit. I think the karma from changing the lady's tire allowed the police officer to let me off with just a warning. But yeah, adventurous day yesterday. Not the most fun I've ever had, but looking forward to today being much better, much more fun. And looking forward to today's episode. If you've been tuning in, you've seen me do the week 1 preview about the Broncos. Lots to go through there. Did a much quicker preview of week 2 in New England because I had another place I had to be early in the morning. But going to start today with week 3, looking at the Dolphins. And this is like one of the most fun games on the schedule from a lot of different angles. We're going to get into it. Some of these storylines you'll know and they'll be familiar. Some of them you will have forgotten, and I'll remind you about them. Some of them are going to be just brand new information to get you up to speed. I'm enjoying this stuff because it helps me kind of assess like what are the different strengths and weaknesses and challenges of the opponents that the Seahawks are going to face coming into the season, just to get the season started and figure out what they need. So fun times. If you didn't watch Real Hawk Talk last night, we had an episode. Nathan Ernst was back. Jeff Simmons was there. Had a great conversation with both of them. I am looking forward. We're going to figure out in the coming week or so. Mina Kimes will be on the show. Danny Kelly will be on the show. So a lot of good stuff coming up. Make sure you continue to stay tuned and give the show a like. Click subscribe. Really, really appreciate it when folks take the time to do that. It helps other people find the show and helps us grow the community. So let's keep it going with that. I also, while we're at it, let me welcome a bunch of new Patreon members. I want to welcome Alan Kress, Brian Holiday, Girthy Twink, Neil G, Boca Hawk, Forrest Anderson, Yannick Meinzer, CS, Bruce Cordingly, Detail Oriented. There are a number of folks that are joining over at patreon.com/hawkblogger. Great way to join the community, support the show, meet other really nice, friendly Seahawks fans, and get access to the Slack channel where, honestly, a lot of people are making friends and talking Hawks, and it's a good way to spend the off parts of the day. Yeah, I thought you might like that one. 67 Plush liked one of those names. All right, folks, how about we get right into it with looking at the Miami Dolphins and what a team this is, right? I mean, if you were to ask me who's my favorite coach in the NFL outside of Seattle, I think it would be Mike McDaniel. I mean, what a fun personality, what a fun offense he runs. Clearly smart, clearly innovative. Has a very clear point of view on what he wants from his players and from his offense. He's got a lot going for him. I like the guy. And as I went back to look at last season for the Dolphins, there's a lot of amazing things that they did last year. So probably first on that list is putting up 70 points against the Seahawks week 1 opponent, the Denver Broncos. Let me take a drink real quick. All right. And I mean, I don't know. 70 points is not something you see very often. 726 yards in a single game. Certainly not something you see very often. And this just offense throughout the season, how many games do they score 40 plus points? 1, 2, 3 games with over 40 points. How many games over 30? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 of their 17 games, they scored over 30 points. That doesn't even sound like that much, but in a year where, again, for the second straight season, the scoring in the league has been a little bit down. It's impressive. It absolutely is impressive. And so, really like what they did on offense, what they've done on offense, who they try to be on offense. And it is going to be a handful. Talk about a test for the Seahawks. This is going to be one coming in week 3 at home against the Dolphins. Now, as you kind of compare the Dolphins 2023 season to their 2022 season, a couple things changed. One, they made progress, obviously, on offense. They jumped from 11th in points scored to 2nd. They jumped from 5th in yards gained to 1st. Number 1 offense in terms of yards per game. Defensively, and this is the part of the side of the ball that I think fewer people know about the Dolphins, like who they are as a defensive team, and they've gone through some changes. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but they also made some gains there. They went from 24th in points allowed in 2022 to 22nd, so a small climb, but they went from 18th in yards allowed to 10th last year. So they were a top 10 defense by yards in the 2023 season. I am curious. I'm going to take a quick look because I didn't do this beforehand. Let me pull up where their defense was from an EPA perspective last season. Um, this is a defense that has some real talent on it. They were the 15th ranked defense in EPA per play. They were the 13th ranked defense in drop back EPA. So against the pass, they were 14th in rush EPA. So pretty consistent against both run and pass. Another thing that changed for them in 2023 that is worth noting, they dropped quite a bit in terms of turnovers on offense. They had been ranked 8th in the NFL in terms of protecting the ball, 8th fewest turnovers in the NFL in 2022. They dropped 13 spots to 21st in the NFL last year with turnovers. They had 25 turnovers last year. They were only +2 in turnover ratio. A lot of that came from Tua Tagovailoa, who had 14 interceptions last year, which was up 6 from 8 in 2022. As far as I'm trying to look and see fumbles wise, Tua Tagovailoa had 13 fumbles last year. 13 fumbles. That is a lot of fumbles. The team had 24 fumbles overall. That is up from 16 the previous year. Tua only had 6 the prior year in 2022. So they put the ball on the ground quite a bit last year. Something for the Seahawks defense is going to be paying close attention to. They did, thankfully for them, have a big jump in turnovers forced. They were 30th in the NFL in turnovers forced in 2022 on defense. They climbed all the way to a top 10 team in terms of turnovers forced to 8th, 22 spots in 2023. So might as well take a look and see who was responsible for a lot of those while we're at it. Fumble recoveries, fumbles forced. Bradley Chubb had 6 of those forced fumbles. Javon Holland had 3. They're great safety. And then as far as interceptions, Jalen Ramsey had 3. Brandon Jones had 2, who's now a Bronco. Jerome Baker had a couple. I've heard of him. He's supposed to be pretty good. So they had a number of interceptions last year. And then as we keep kind of going down the line of things that changed for them last year, when you look at their passing situation, they actually attempted fewer passes in 2023. So they only attempted the 20th most pass attempts. Now you'd think of this offense as heavily pass oriented. It is, but as far as getting to a more even balance of rushing the ball, I mean, their run game is lethal as well. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But they still climbed, and even though they had fewer attempts, they climbed in terms of yards. So they gained a few more yards passing, even with fewer attempts. They climbed from 4th in passing yards in the NFL to 1st. So this was the best passing team in the NFL by yards. The most prolific, I guess, is probably a better way to think about it. They've thrown 30 touchdown passes each of the last 2 years. Interestingly, though, they've allowed 27 touchdown passes in each of the last 2 years. You'd think with guys like Jalen Ramsey, Xavier Howard, a lot of these players that they have, that they would be harder to throw touchdowns against. But this was the 26th ranked defense in terms of passing touchdowns allowed in 2022, the 25th in 2023. So that is a vulnerability for them in terms of giving up touchdown passes. And then let's see. Other changes. So rushing offense, rushing in general on offense, dramatically increased the number of rush attempts in this last season. They went from 390 rush attempts in 2022 to 456 last year. They took a 16-point jump. They were 31st in rushing attempts in 2022. They were 15th in 2023. So top half of the league after being the second fewest in 2022. So a big change there. Also a massive change in rushing yards. They went from 1,686 yards rushing to 2,300 yards rushing. That was sixth most in the NFL after being 25th the year before, a 19-point jump in their rankings. Their rush defense, as I mentioned, pretty good. They allowed the seventh fewest rushing yards in the NFL. And from a yards per carry perspective, they only allowed 3.8 yards per carry, which was sixth best in the NFL. They've been sixth best in the NFL in rushing yards per carry the last two seasons. So again, I think people don't understand that the Dolphins' defense has also been pretty good. It has not been electric like the offense, but their defense has been pretty legit. If you go ahead and you look at this from a drive perspective, looking at their drive efficiency, this was the third-ranked offense in terms of points per drive, third-ranked offense in terms of yards per drive, but 15th ranked in terms of time per drive. This is a big play offense. That's not a surprise to anybody. They score a lot, they move the ball a lot, but they do it pretty quickly. On defense, this was the 9th ranked. This was the 16th ranked defense in terms of points per drive last year, 11th in yards per drive, and similarly 15th in time per drive. So opponents, they're in that case, you're pretty much even across the board. This was, close to a league average defense with some strengths as far as running goes. Let's talk a little bit about some key aspects of this team. We have seen Mike McDaniel versus Mike McDonald is a real thing. This was a guy that really gave Mike McDonald trouble in his first season as defensive coordinator for the Ravens. So let's go back in the Wayback Machine to 2022. And there was a game that year where the Dolphins played the Ravens. And in this game, the Ravens got out to a 28-7 lead at halftime. Mike McDonald's defense was doing well, held the Dolphins' powerful offense to no points in the first quarter, just 7 points in the second quarter, 28-7. This game was in Baltimore. This game was over, right? You do not come back from a 28-7 deficit on the road at halftime. Well, I got news for you. They did. This game ended up wildly with the Dolphins scoring 35 points in the second half. 35 points. They would ultimately win this game 42-38. I'll go back and look. My guess is the 547 yards and 42 points is probably the most that the Ravens gave up that Mike McDonald's defense has given up in his 2 seasons. Let me do a quick look. 42, that's the most. 547, definitely the most in 2022. Let's take a look in 2023. Yes, so that remains the worst game in Mike McDonald's defensive coordinator history in the NFL. And he's talked about that game. He's talked about how it affected him. He's talked about how he tried to make adjustments and how he worked with his players on it. But in that game, Tua Tagovailoa threw for 469 yards, 6 touchdowns, and just 2 interceptions. I mean, 2 interceptions still, but 6 touchdowns. He was only sacked once for 8 yards. So that was very much a passing-oriented game. Tyreek Hill had 190 yards receiving and 2 touchdowns. Jalen Waddle had 171 yards and 2 touchdowns. So that is wild, that game. If you have any concerns that Mike McDonald will be anything but eyes open for this game in week 3, don't worry about it. Mike McDonald knows every bit of what Mike McDaniel and the Dolphins can do to a defense. And so in some ways, this is a pretty good little, it's hard to call it a rivalry, but it's a pretty meaningful part of Mike McDonald's development and how he's approached things. And I would assume that Mike McDaniel takes a lot of pride in going up against one of the best defensive minds in the NFL. As we look forward, I said that was this big game, the worst game for Mike McDonald in his defensive coordinator history. Well, the Dolphins went to Baltimore again last year. So how did that go? Well, not as well for Mike McDaniel, I'll tell you that much. He got off to a faster start. The Dolphins actually scored first. They were ahead 7-0. They would eventually go up 10-7. And then it was all Ravens. They did not score. The Dolphins scored 13 points. They kicked a field goal with 3:10 to go in the game, or in the second quarter, I should say. They only scored 6 points the rest of the way. They would score 19 points on the day, and end up losing that game 56-19. 56-19. Remember, Tua Tagovailoa had that 500-yard, 6-touchdown game? Well, not so much this time. 237 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, was sacked 3 times instead of just 1, just a 71.9 rating. Devon Achane, I should say. Achane, I always get that name wrong. Achane did rush for 107 yards. So from a rushing perspective, they were still able to get some production there, but 45 of those yards came on 1 carry. As far as Tyreek Hill, instead of like 190 yards and 2 touchdowns, he had 76 yards, no touchdowns. They did not have Jalen Waddle for this game. It's also worth mentioning that they were missing some starters on the offensive line. The Dolphins were. Their offensive line during that game was Robert Jones, Austin Jackson, Liam Eichenberg, Teron Armstead, and Lester Cotton. Pretty sure Jackson and Armstead are the only guys that were meant to be starters. So they were missing a bunch of guys in that game. But we'll talk about it. Some of those guys aren't there anymore anyway. And if I go back and I look at the Dolphins, so we did this for Mike McDonald. That was the worst game for Mike McDonald in 2022. That's the worst game over his 2-year history as a DC. That game of scoring 19 against the Ravens and only getting 375 yards, that was, let's see, that was their fourth fewest point total in 2023. And it was toward the bottom. I'd say like their fourth fewest yardage total. So I wouldn't quite say that it completely turned the same way. It wasn't as dominant as Mike McDaniel's. But one of the things I'd say there is the reality is Mike McDaniel and the Dolphins did nothing in the first half in 2022. They scored 35 points in the second half. And so if you really look at this, for 3 quarters, 3 halves in this case, out of 2 games, Mike McDonald has won this matchup. 1 half, which is 1 quarter of 2 games, Mike McDaniel blew up and had an amazing half, and his team. So this narrative that Mike McDaniel is kind of the what's the word? The kryptonite for Mike McDonald. Don't buy it. I don't think the data supports that. I'm more interested to see what Sean McVay, who came in last year, but that's another preview for another day, how that will go back and forth. But just wanted to kind of give people a little bit more insight into that matchup. So let's get into actually talking about changes on this roster. The Dolphins had quite a bit of turnover on this roster. And some of these players are going to be familiar names, folks, that either we know or I've talked about in other previews. So let's first talk about the players that they added. Jonnu Smith, tight end from the Falcons. I'm going to go a little bit more into him in a little bit. Jody Forston, tight end from the Chiefs. Aaron Brewer, we'll talk about him. Center from the Titans. Davon Nixon, defensive tackle. Isaiah Mack, defensive tackle. Nevin Gallimore, defensive tackle. Benito Jones, he's actually going to get some play. I think those other guys are mostly back end of the roster guys. Benito Jones from the Lions, defensive tackle. Jonathan Harris, defensive tackle from the Broncos. A guy named Jordyn Brooks, linebacker from the Seahawks. Shaq Barrett, edge player from the Bucks. Anthony Walker, we'll also mention him a little bit more, linebacker from the Browns. Jordan Poyer, one of the best safeties in the NFL during his career, left Buffalo for a pretty cheap deal with the Dolphins. We'll talk about that. Kendall Fuller, also a name we'll talk about at corner from the Commanders. Jack Driscoll on the offensive line comes from the Eagles. And then Tier Tart. He is a defensive tackle that came from the Texans by way of the Titans. And we'll talk about him. He's a pretty big addition for them potentially, but I think there's some reasons to think that it's a problem. I won't go into all the guys they re-signed. They did extend Raheem Mostert, who had a just massive year in 2023. Raheem Mostert had 1,000 yards, 18 touchdowns on the ground, 3 touchdowns receiving, 21 touchdowns total. If you're a fantasy football player, I'm sure you already knew that, but a big player for them. And then when you get Devon Achane back from injury, he's also just a huge playmaker for them. But these are the departures. Here are the guys that they lost. Biggest names first. Christian Wilkins, defensive tackle. They tried to keep him. They went through a bunch of different things, and he didn't stay. He went to the Raiders. So he's gone from the middle of their defensive line. Robert Hunt, considered one of the best guards in the NFL, he left for the Carolina Panthers. Brandon Jones, who I talked about in the Broncos preview, he went to the Broncos. He took the place of Justin Simmons. Interestingly, when I've listened to the Dolphins podcast that I started listening to yesterday, they don't think that highly of Brandon Jones. They think the Dolphins actually, they were laughing about it, that the agent did a really good job for Brandon Jones by getting the deal that he got. They don't think he's worth it. So keep that in mind as we go back to the week one. And I already brought up that there were some issues with the Broncos secondary. There may be more than I even realized if Brandon Jones is not as good as maybe he seems to be. Another important name, Andrew Van Ginkel, also a great name. Who doesn't want to say Van Ginkel? He leaves for the Vikings, one of their best edge players. Raekwon Davis, their nose tackle, their defensive tackle, left for the Colts. Xavier Howard, the corner, once great corner, was released. Jerome Baker, know that name. He went to the Seahawks. And then guys like Emmanuel Ogbah, Deshaun Elliott, Cedric Wilson, all these guys are gone. Robbie Chosen, Chase Claypool, Melvin Ingram, Bruce Irvin, Justin Houston. They had a lot of guys that kind of started filling in last year for them. So a lot of change on this Dolphins roster. As far as their draft class in this season, just to have an idea of some of the big names to pay attention to. One should be familiar. Their first round pick, Chop Robinson, was picked at 21. We'll see where he figures into this team. Patrick Paul, a tackle, a developmental tackle out of Houston, was picked in the second round. Jalen Wright, a running back from Tennessee, kind of fits in with the typical things that Mike McDaniel wants. Ran the second fastest 40-yard dash among all running backs at the combine. Really a long, big play threat every time he touches the ball. Muhammad Kamara, the edge player from Colorado State, interesting guy. Malik Washington, receiver who I really liked out of Virginia. He was drafted in the 6th round. Taj Washington, a receiver out of USC, who I think is a decent sleeper pick, was a pick in the 7th. So a lot of this was loading back up on offense, and not as much on the places where you would think they need it, which is offensive and defensive line. Chop Robinson, Patrick Paul, we'll see what comes there, but they did add some more playmakers. And so those are kind of the comings and goings, but I have to add a pretty important one to that list, an important couple to that list. So Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb are their two best edge rushers. They lost both of those players to serious injuries last year. So Jalen Phillips tore an Achilles. And so he is coming back from that. And Bradley Chubb tore an ACL. There is question about whether either of these players will start the season on the roster. Jalen Phillips recently had some comments that he's feeling really good and looking forward to being back. Some people think he'll be back for week 1. But there's a decent chance that both of these guys will be on PUP, which would mean they would not face the Seahawks in week 3. They would not be able to be on the roster. So that's a pretty important part of this matchup to pay attention to. If they don't have Jalen Phillips and or Bradley Chubb, then you are really starting to rely on Shaq Barrett, who is an older player at this point and not the same guy he once was. Chop Robinson becomes more important. Oh, one other name that they added late in free agency that I forgot to mention is Calais Campbell. That is a big name to add, both figuratively and literally. Calais is like a million years old, but is still he's still a tough guy. Still ends up being effective regardless. But point being, again, if Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb are out, it means Chop Robinson, Shaquille Barrett. You're talking about a very different crew. And because they lost Andrew Van Ginkel, who was also a very good edge rusher, they're thinner there than they were before. So if those guys are both available, I also have questions about how effective they're going to be earlier in the season or in the season in general. A lot of times, guys coming back from those injuries are not quite the same player. Although, if we talk about Jordyn Brooks, didn't expect him back for week 1. He was back. He played played pretty well the whole season. So hard to say, but that's a pretty important pair of injuries to pay attention to. As far as this lineup goes, when you listen to Dolphins fans, Dolphins media, analysts kind of go through, they feel very good about the receivers, as well they should. Jalen Waddle, Tyreek Hill. They added Odell Beckham. That's another name I don't think I'd mentioned before. I personally think Odell Beckham is cooked. I thought he was pretty bad for the Ravens last year. He did not move well. He did not get open that often. Maybe he didn't fit in with that offense, but I'm not like they were talking about how great Odell Beckham is. I don't see it. So I'm not as concerned, but that is 3 big names. Jalen Waddle, Tyreek Hill, and Odell Beckham are their top 3 receivers. From a tight end perspective, they last year really did not have anybody who was a threat at tight end. Jonnu Smith he's not a guy that's had like a huge career, but he's a big run after the catch guy. He had 582 yards for the Ravens last year, 3 touchdowns. He's had as many as 8 touchdowns in a season when he played for the Titans. And he's an upgrade. There's no doubt that he's an upgrade. And who knows? I mean, there's guys that when they go into Mike McDaniel's offense, they are a completely different kind of player. So they do have a pretty potent set of weapons from a receiving standpoint. And then we just talked about their running back room is littered with speed merchants, not just the receiver crew. So Raheem Mostert, incredibly fast, big play guy. Devin Achane is obviously like, there's some folks that if he was not injured last year for a full season, they have him as maybe one of the best couple of running backs in the NFL, just incredibly explosive. Jalen Wright, I just mentioned the draft pick. Old Husky, Salvin Ahmed, also a fast guy. Jeff Wilson, former 49er, also a fast guy. So they have got player after player to deploy in the running back room. And so all that's good, right? If not great. Tua Tagovailoa, he is a mid-level quarterback. He is not elite. He's got some elite numbers, but has some real limits in terms of where he can put the ball. But what really changes things is the offensive line. So this offensive line went from having guys like Connor Williams at center, who is considered, when he was playing, one of the best centers in the NFL. Some people consider him one of the best linemen in the NFL, but just a great center. Robert Hunt, who is considered one of the best guards in the NFL. So those were their 2 best offensive linemen. Teron Armstead is pretty good, but Teron Armstead is also getting kind of old. He's 32, but he's decent. But you went from Connor Williams and Robert Hunt to Aaron Brewer and Robert Jones. So this is It is a really questionable offensive line. Really questionable offensive line. And they went from being a very good offensive line or one of the better ones. They had a lot of injuries, but this isn't a good crew. In fact, let's take a look at where these guys ranked. So Austin Jackson, their right tackle, he had a 67 grade last year from PFF, 62 in pass block. So not great as a pass blocker, better as a run blocker. Liam Eichenberg, who is a guy that they think could get some real chances to play guard, he was a 45 graded player last year, 43 graded pass blocker. Teron Armstead was good at left tackle, 79, like definitely like very good left tackle. Robert Jones, guard, 57.6 graded player, 49.3 pass block. Isaiah Wynn, the other guard, 47.8 graded player, 67 pass block. So a little bit better pass blocking, but not good. And if we look a little further at these guys that they got, let's look at Aaron Brewer. One of the things that the guys that were watching him in practice were just saying that the Dolphins beat reporters is he just is small. He's 275 pounds. That is a small guy to play center. And he did have a 71 grade overall last year, but just 52.5 pass blocking. He was a very good run blocker, 78.7. So likely what Mike McDaniel is trying to do there is get a mover. He wants a center that can be a puller, that can help them get out in space and get his running backs going. But from a pass blocking perspective, they took a massive step backwards in the middle of that line. Yeah, I mean, really, 4/5 of that line is highly suspect in terms of pass blocking, and that was not the case last year. So that is something that going into Seattle in week 3, they will not have had a lot of time together. It will be a very loud stadium with what we believe to be a very effective defensive line, very powerful, very disruptive, and very confusing from a scheme perspective in terms of where the pressure is coming from, how Mike McDonald's going to scheme things up. That is a potentially big advantage for the Seahawks in this game. So that's one place to look. Now, if we go to the defensive side of the ball, the Dolphins lost their the middle of their defensive line. So they lost Christian Wilkins, who was a good run defender, like 70 graded run defender, a 71 graded pass rusher. He had 61 pressures last year. He played 968 snaps. For a defensive tackle, that is wild to play that many snaps. They're going to have to replace all of those snaps. We'll talk about who's going to take them on in a second. But Christian Wilkins gone. Also gone is Raekwon Davis, who was their nose tackle. And he got more money than the guys that they brought in. So who did they bring in? They brought in Tier Tart, who was a real problem in Tennessee. Like they ended up kicking him off the team. He basically quit on them. And in Tennessee, he was a 57.6 graded player, 51.6 against the run. With Houston, who he caught on for the last 2 weeks of the season, he was a 38 graded player, 45 against the run. He had one good year in 2022 where he's a 73 graded player, 67 against the run, actually had some pass rush as well. But the guys that I was listening to said he came in out of shape, Raekwon Davis was a guy that they lost that was really good about staying in shape, cared about his body, was a pro. Teair Tart is anything but a pro. That is not who this guy is. The other guy that they added was, where's his name? Benito Jones. Benito Jones. So let's take a look at Benito Jones. This is the other guy that they think might be part of the nose tackle kind of plan. He's a bigger dude, 335 pounds. For Detroit last year, he was a 39 graded player, 32 against the run. So the middle of this line went from Christian Wilkins and Raekwon Davis to, Benito Jones, Teair Tart, and Calais Campbell. I mean, Calais Campbell is a guy that, if we can look at what he did last year, he's 38 years old, but he was an 80 graded player last year. He's still a effective player, 80 graded run defender. So he definitely helps. He had 42 pressures last year, so he's still an effective pass rusher. I mean, this guy has just had quite the career. I mean, he's just been a handful. It's a lot of green, a lot of elite blues on his grading chart. So Calais Campbell does help them there, but can't last forever. And then Zach Sealer is the other likely defensive end for them, and he's fine. He's like a league average defensive end. He did have 60 pressures last year, so that's pretty impressive. But I mean, losing Andrew Van Ginkel is a really big deal for the way they played things. There's some belief that they might try to play Jordyn Brooks a little bit on the edge, which would be fascinating. From a linebacker perspective, one of the other moves they made that I liked was adding Anthony Walker. Anthony Walker is a guy that played for Cleveland. I'd actually wanted the Seahawks to try to get him a year ago, and maybe wasn't a scheme fit or whatever. He's a little bit on the older side. He's like 29, but has been a pretty good linebacker when he's gotten on the field, especially as a coverage backer. He was a 77 graded coverage backer last year. He was 90 graded coverage backer the year before, 78 the year. So he has had consistently good fortune as a coverage linebacker. And given how Mike McDaniel was going to want to try to do things, I think that's a pretty decent fit. He only got like $1.5 million. The other thing that's a pretty important thing to recognize is that the Dolphins had a change at defensive coordinator. So Vic Fangio was their defensive coordinator last year. It is Anthony Weaver this year. And Anthony Weaver's history, he was another connection to Mike McDonald. He was the defensive line coach for the Ravens last year and the associate head coach. He was the defensive line coach for Mike McDonald in both of Mike McDonald's seasons in Baltimore. Now he's getting a chance to be defensive coordinator. Will the Ravens be running Mike McDonald's defense? Probably. And so we're going to see who does it better, the student or the master. Who's got the better personnel to run it? We'll find out. We also know that Mike McDaniel is going to be picking his brain, Anthony Weaver's brain, about that defense, about how to apply it. They're going to practice against it every day. So in some senses, Mike McDaniel should be the most prepared he's ever been to face Mike McDonald's defensive scheme. But like we've said, it's not just the scheme. It's not just the players. It's the play calling. And Mike McDonald is elite when it comes to his play calling. Don't know what Anthony Weaver is going to be. But other parts of this Dolphins defense, I mentioned Andrew Van Ginkel, by the way. He was their top graded player last year, 91 graded player, which is amazing. Javon Holland, a safety that a lot of people don't know, also a 90 graded player, elite coverage safety, great run defender, just a very good player. One of the most underrated players in terms of general awareness in the league. Bradley Chubb was an 89 graded player on defense. And so a lot of these guys, we'll see where they are in terms of availability with guys like Bradley Chubb, but some really good players. Jalen Phillips, again, had 27 pressures last year in just, 8 games. Bradley Chubb had 70 pressures in his games. He played 16 games. So his injury was pretty late in the year. But the secondary, this is an interesting one. So everybody knows Jalen Ramsey. Everybody knows Jalen Ramsey versus DK Metcalf is always must-see TV. So this is going to be the first rematch since Ramsey went to the Dolphins, and it's going to be in Seattle. And what have we heard? We've heard that DK Metcalf's going to be moved around by Ryan Grubb. I have heard Jalen Ramsey's going to travel with the number 1 receivers, as I think he's done in the past. So you're going to get a lot of Jalen Ramsey against DK Metcalf. But from there, you've got Kendall Fuller. All right. So Kendall Fuller comes from, I heard some pretty good debates on Kendall Fuller on some of the Dolphins podcasts I was listening to. Kendall Fuller has been a very effective corner. So he's a good corner. He's one of the best corners in the game. Last year had an 83 grade as a cover corner. Pretty decent run defense as well. So nothing there. But as far as like taking the ball away, going from Xavier Howard to Kendall Fuller, Xavier Howard has like 17 more interceptions in his career, something like that, in a significant number of fewer seasons than Fuller. So I guess there was some debate about which one's better, but the fact of the matter is, as of now, there's no doubt Kendall Fuller's better. And so Kendall Fuller is a pretty big addition. He helps give them 2 pretty close to lockdown corners. But then you get into your nickel corner, and Kader Kuhu, and you might be saying, who? Is their nickel corner. He was a mediocre nickel corner last year, 62 graded cover corner, gave up 7 touchdowns last year on defense. So he is a weakness, and he's a guy that JSN, you have to imagine JSN is going to try to get isolated on him, and JSN could have a big day against this crew. So when I look at this defense versus the Seahawks offense, obviously, similarly to their offense versus our defense, I think it's the defensive line. Their defensive line has had some real losses, especially in the middle. If the Seahawks offensive line can be healthy and, play hopefully better than we've seen before, the running game could be a big part of this one. If Jalen Phillips and or Bradley Chubb don't play, I think that's going to affect significantly the passing game as well. Going against Shaq Barrett and Chop Robinson is not the same. So there is, like, I think a lot of folks would say the Dolphins are the clear favorites to win this game, even though it's in Seattle. Not so sure. I think the fact that this game is earlier in the season in some ways plays to the Dolphins' favor because they're a warm weather team. It's going to be warmer in Seattle at that time. all those kinds of things. The Dolphins tend to be more potent early in the year. They tend to seem to wear down later in the year. At the same time, Bradley Chubb, Jalen Phillips may not be back in time. Their offensive line may not be gelling yet. So there are some reasons why this could be a potentially pretty good time for the Seahawks to catch the Dolphins in week 3. All right, folks. Those were the things that I wanted to share with you about the Dolphins, the Seahawks week 3 opponent. If you haven't given the show a like, please take a moment to do so. I really appreciate it. It helps the show out, helps other people find the show and join the community. Subscribe to the channel and consider joining as a patron or a YouTube member. It would be great to have you. I know I would enjoy it, and I think you would too, to be very honest. So consider coming over here to Hawk Blogger Mornings to see to join as part of the crew. Love to have you. I am going to head out for my hike. Hopefully it all works out well. Hopefully it's less adventurous than yesterday, at least in the bad sense of the word. I hope you all have a wonderful day. I am Brian Nemhauser. This has been the 116th episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. Take care, everybody.